So part of what the work that I've been fortunate enough to do with practitioners is, so what's that equity literacy work that we have to do to help us interrupt some of that stuff that's in our shopping cart, right? In order for it to not sort of metastasize and constantly be at play for us. So part of the work that I've been able to do over the last 16, 17 years is really sort of cultivate what are ways in which we know from research around interrupting that stuff that's in our shopping cart and being diligent about it, right? So there's 5 particular sort of strategies that post psychology has really sort of paid particular attention to around what's the necessary understandings that we have. And I am intentionally saying this is about interrupting, not eliminating, right? We are interrupting the habits of this stuff. So the first one is counter-stereotypic imaging, right? So counter-stereotypic imaging is really the idea of, like, you know, recognizing that as a society, we have, as I showed you earlier, we have been consuming at a high level tons of stereotypes about each other, from Halloween costumes to the American Girl doll to the football teams to Aunt Jemima. We are consuming stereotypes on a consistent basis that we have to be intentional about creating the counter narratives that are necessary for us to undo that level of saturation, right? And I should say to continuously undo, because it's a one and done. You just don't, you know, do a couple of books during Black History Month and Women's History Month and, you know, Indigenous Month and, oh, I'm all good. I have counter stereotyped myself, but it is a constant sort of interplay. And because the intention is, like, we've got to address the subconscious power of what we have been ingesting to replicate, to remove it, right? To interrupt it. Here is an image from this author, Jessica Love, who's a children's book author. Julian is a mermaid. It's about an Afro-Latino boy who wants to dress up as a mermaid to go to school, right? The idea of that we're super intentional about sort of really changing the types of imagery we're consuming, right? There have been schools that I have worked with that have taken this counter-stereotypic imaging, and not only in their books, but also said, let's put it on the wall, right? Let's make sure that our kids that the hidden curriculum that we put on our walls are also intentionally sort of being, we are sort of giving them stuff to do. So as you can see in some of these imagery, you know, that one says, I don't have to be a guy to be colorful, right? The one below says, not all Mexicans play soccer, right? Or in this one, you know, I'm an honor roll student with big dreams, right? Trying to really reconstruct this idea that, you know, that Black students can be an honor roll, can be an honors class. Another one is perspective taking. The idea that we have to practice walking in somebody else's shoes, right? We can't presume that we have all the cultural sets of experiences or the tools to know about everyone, right? But we've got to be humble enough to recognize what it means to actually ask the question, tell me your story, tell me about what it's like, right? So that we can develop a couple of cognitive tools, the cultural reasoning types of understandings, right? Making sense of of how we see and hear somebody else's narrative to help us understand how to make sense of a particular situation, right? So it's kind of like when practitioners ask kids who misbehave, instead of asking, you know, the question, what's wrong with you? Asking them the question, what's happened to you? What brought you to that particular behavior, right? Where you're taking the role of, I need to sit in your space to try to capture an understanding of your reasoning, right? The same thing around diplomatic mindset, which is sort of an understanding of how do we make sense of how our own personal beliefs about cultural groups and our own self-understandings are also part of how we understand sort of other people's experiences, right? So how I see and understand the experiences that, for example, my wife has is also connected to how I see the world, right? So making sure that I'm able to manage sort of my personal beliefs and experiences in relation to hers, so that as she describes sort of what it means to be a woman in the workplace, I'm not just using my frame of reference, but I'm taking a moment to actually consider her own set of experiences. And some of that perspective taking process involves sort of what do I know, what do I experience, and how do I practice that new knowledge and set of experiences, right? And that means that it's going to involve us not just reading new books, right? I love the book study clubs that are happening throughout the country where folks are reading a whole mess of books, but you know, also take the leap of also moving beyond the book and deciding on where am I going? Where do I go grocery shopping? which, I was sharing that, in my county, there's 2 different Macy's that are in my community, right? There's a Macy's that is predominantly, the patrons there are predominantly white, and there's another Macy's that is predominantly Latinx, right? And I can see neither two never go to each other's Macy's, even though they carry the same stuff, right? The Macy's that's predominantly white, they usually, I found they play Celine Dion, which I love me some Celine Dion, right? And then my Latinx Macy's, right? I know if I want a particular energy, of if I want to listen to some salsa or bachata, I can go there and have that. But we gotta be comfortable enough to be able to exist and sort of go into these different environments intentionally. The other sort of element that we need to be attentive to is this, and it connected to perspective taking, is actually intergroup contact, right? We can't talk about wanting to understand sort of the lived realities of others if we don't actually interact with people that are different than us, right? We have to be super intentional about that. And these set of imageries that you have here, right? On the top, you see Bush 2 and Ellen DeGeneres, who were caught watching a football game together, and there was a kerfuffle about, it's like, how could she do this? And given his LGBTQ stances and his hesitations during his administration, right? But what I also saw is just the opportunity that was going on here for them to actually do intergroup contact, right? Because for both of them, there's probably part of what they need in terms of really enhancing their shopping cart. And then at the bottom, you see Martha Stewart and Snoop Dogg. And for those who are not familiar, Martha Stewart is a media mogul. Snoop Dogg is a rapper and a media mogul himself. And they have this cooking show where they do what I call intergroup contact. They are sharing each other's food and storylines that are connected to it, right? But the idea is you gotta interact with people who are different than you to actually build up different things in your shopping cart. The next element that we gotta pay attention to is individuating, right? So aside from sort of that intergroup, within that intergroup contact, the intention around that is that you're doing some individuation work, meaning because we carry around a whole mess of stereotypes, right? We've got to be able to parcel out that some of those stereotypes don't fit everybody you see, right? So I always tell the story of, when I was in my doctoral program, I had one of my advisors who said to me very honestly, and from her place of what exists in her shopping cart as a white woman, she said to me, Eddie, I don't understand. How is it that you can be Black and you speak Spanish, right? Because I was born and raised in Panama, so Spanish is my first language. And for her, she was having that moment of dissonance, right? And I reckon for her, what she was experiencing was moments of individuation where she had stereotyped ideas of what types of languages Black people speak, and it didn't necessarily include Spanish, right? And that was sort of a rough element of what she was experiencing. But part of the reality around individuating is the need for regular one-on-one conversation that has to be not about, so tell me about all your food of your people, but actual connecting and understanding sort of who is the individual that we're interfacing. And then the other element is improved decision-making, right? The idea that, and I'm trying to remember, I think it was Malcolm Gladwell who talked about sort of the millions of information that we get constantly, right? That we're constantly sort of consuming a lot of information. And what we do is we respond to things based on that information, right? When we see somebody walking towards us on the sidewalk, on the street, and they happen to be a Black male that's wearing a do-rag, right? That there's a set of information that we're consuming, and we've got to be attentive to what are the filters that we're using to make decisions around our own behavior, right? So the idea of improved decision-making is interrupting sort of the stereotypes that we may use to see and make sense of that information so that we slow ourselves down, right? To make this, to remove the types of discretions or ambiguities that we bring into, particularly around decision-making. I know within TBIS, there's an attention to this idea of vulnerable decision-making. Like, let's slow down the moments in which we are seeing student behavior, and we actually ask the question, what is it exactly that I'm seeing here, right? Is it really aggressive behavior, or is it just that or is it just my point of reference that I'm codifying it as aggression? And these are elements, these set of strategies have to not just happen as one-off, but has to be baked into the manner of our professional learning if we're looking at trying to diversify our workforce and create these types of environments where we have an array of of practitioners in our environments, we've got to be intentional in recognizing that as a society, we've had very few opportunities for us to develop and to actually practice these types of strategies, right? In particular, I can definitely, highlight sort of intergroup contact, right? So we think about, our own personal experiences around where we live, who we allow into our homes for dinner, right? Who do we hang out with on the weekend? Who do we call for help, right? And thinking about sort of what's the degree of intergroup contact that we have developed over our lifespan. Some of it, we know that it's probably, for some of us, it's tied to sort of our early lived experiences, as children, that gets carried into our early parts of our adulthood. And then by the time we are, much older, right, we become very cemented in terms of who's in our circles, right? And the question I ask us to really consider is, what's that intergroup contact? What's the nature of that intergroup contact? And especially when we're thinking about sort of our practitioners as entering our workforce, as being part of our school environments, right? They're thirsty for the set of intergroup contact that's really going to enhance their opportunities within the school, so that they not only be successful for themselves and their peers, but also for the kids that they're actually serving. I'm going to pause there. Yes, I did. I was like, is that the last slide? I want to thank folks, and I want to have a moment, pause there, because I know there's stuff in the chat. Nora? I don't know if
Eddie,
you want to do a
thank you
little bit
so
of Q&A.
much.
Yeah.
We do want to open it up and ask people to make comments or ask questions. I think a lot of the comments had to do with really this notion of having conversations across cultural groups, and then also, around being uncomfortable and sort of learning how to become comfortable with discomfort. Right,
exactly. And in particular, that discomfort comes from the fact that we haven't necessarily, for a couple of reasons. One is, Wing Su talks about that there's a set of protocols that get in our way of us being comfortable with this reality. And some of it is one of the protocols he talks about is the recognition that there's certain topics we're not allowed to talk about, right? It's kind of like when you go to an office party, or you go to somebody's, holiday party, there's certain things we're told or expected, we can't talk about those things, right? And when and race and racism, sex and sexism are some of those sort of elements that we have been nicely trained. It's been put into our shopping carts that we're not supposed to talk about. And it becomes uncomfortable because we're not exactly sure where any of us sit. We haven't had the opportunity to really build a muscle to have those conversations, right? So that's why I encourage us to sort of, yes, practice with our book studies, but stretch outside of those book studies and actually sort of move into a realm of where are the spaces in which you're also expending your personal time, right? That you're also sort of, that is included in part of sort of your development of your own sort of professional learning. There's a school district I worked with years ago that part of what they built this intergroup contact piece into as one of the requirements, the PD requirements for the year, right? So each staff member had to fulfill a requirement, and one of them was intergroup contact, right? And they gave them options of what that looked like, right? It did include book studies, but they strongly pushed people to go beyond the book studies, because you can always do book studies, right? But it's really a matter of sort of where the opportunities where we can get to talk out loud around sort of where those spaces of uncomfortability, so that we can, on one level, sort of really practice of what lives in my shopping cart that's making me uncomfortable, so I can develop a level of less uncomfortability around them.
Yeah, I actually think an interesting point was raised around how students and even people do tend to cluster in their own groups, even when we create opportunities for intergroup contact. So I'm wondering, Eddie, if you could talk a little bit about that, sort of building genuine friendships across groups is still often a challenge in our culture.
Right, exactly. Well, part of, we think about sort of our own friendship networks that we've developed, right? They generally sort of have developed due to the varied sort of levels of interest that we carry, right? So so I ask us as we think about sort of the development of those friendship circles is look at sort of the types of arenas in which you express or explore your interests, right? So I think about sort of like myself, right? So I am there's a couple of things I've loved forever, right? One of them is running. I have been a runner for now going on about 33, 34 years, right? And I love running, right? And for me, I will join a running club in a heartbeat, right? Because it is an interest that just like, it just gives me life. And so part of what I've been fascinated by and being very intentional is making sure that I get to join a variety of running clubs, right? Where I get to meet people that I typically would not, and be able to develop a friendship that is drawn from sort of a point of reference of interest, right? Some of us have sort of interest areas that are around knitting, or interests around, shopping at Best Buy, right? Or, because the beauty of sort of our current reality is that there is an interest club for everybody, right? And the thing that we have to be attentive to is how do we make sure that as we are exploring our own interests, that we're also able to stretch ourselves and connect with people on the level of initially as an interest to really sort of expand and intentionally sort of expand sort of what those sort of elements of intergroup contact happen, right? So for example, for me, I have to be super intentional around the manner in which how, and this is something that actually years ago my wife and I had to really think long and hard around, because we both went to predominantly white colleges for undergrad and as well as for grad school, and we had to be intentional around how we built up our intergroup contact with white people, because we realized, because we were in such environments, we ended up sort of really developing close-knit groupings around other folks of color, because we were making sense of the environments we were in. But at the same time, we weren't necessarily sort of building up the types of intergroup contact, with white people. So we've made it a point over the last 15, 20 years, particularly modeling for our own kids, what it necessarily means for us to develop sort of those types of close friendships. And in a way that you're able to kind of understand sort of the individual sort of interests and characteristics that those folks that whoever you're kind of having intergroup contact with brings into your life, right? Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that, my wife and I had a fair, where we said, anybody white people want to sort of be our friends, come on over, we're taking applications. It wasn't nothing like that, okay? Right? But we had to be intentional around sort of like, where are the circles that we're traveling in? Who are we interacting with, and some of it actually emerged from our own kids when they in elementary school, right? So now our kids, the parents of the kids that my kids are really close friends with, my kids are 16 and 20 now, we're really close with their parents, right? And our interest really began around our kids, right? We would see each other at the plays, or at the basketball games or the volleyball games, and we just started hanging out and building sort of this close connection predicated first initially on our kids, but also began to really understand sort of where the touch points of connections that we could have with each other, that our sort of cultural differences actually became strong assets of our friendship circles. So I'd encourage that we really sort of be attentive to sort of where the interest points of what we like to do and who do we gravitate to when we are in those spaces, right? And, I'll be honest, I run 5K races all the time, right? Except for this year, ain't nobody running nothing, right? But one of the things I'm always mindful of is I'm usually one of very few folks of color at 5K or 10K races. And I find it fascinating that very few people want to talk to me, right? Like I end up standing there stretching by myself, where people are like randomly talking to each other. So what I started doing? I just started going up to people, hey, I see, so where are you from? What's your running pace, right? Because part of it is I realized I have to also sort of help folks sort of practice, how do you break that ice, right? Around developing that intergroup contact skill.
So one of the participants, Ada Cruz Farron, asked, how do you respond to staff of color concerned with white staff talking about race and supporting our students of color when they don't feel that they're trained enough? we are trying to discourage silence and encourage listening for all staff, so students are seen, heard, and supported. But some staff of color seem hesitant to encourage white staff. So they want, because they're worried about white staff doing more harm than good. So any ideas around that?
You know, one of the strongest difficulties that we have to manage for ourselves, particularly as adults, is, and this is, something, sort of you recognize, I've recognized in terms of in being in a marriage over 22 years, is when do you listen? When do you talk? Right? And sort of being able to, especially when, you're in a context where, it's, so for example, if you're in a space of you're doing perspective taking, that cultural reasoning cognitive tool requires that you be in a space of being a learner, right? And it doesn't mean that it diminishes an individual. It doesn't mean that there is a inferiority, superiority that's being situated here, but rather, it's a moment where, as individuals, we get an opportunity to have new stuff added to our shopping cart in a way that we can kind of contend with, right? And that's one of sort of the pieces that as we diversify our school teams in our environments, right? That we give each other the grace to be able to say to each other, hey, I think this is a moment where, there's going to be some narrative talk that's going to happen, AKA, this is a moment where, a particular population wants to share their story. And part of the sharing of story is very cathartic, and it is it's not only sort of laying that out, but as a learner, we need to be in a space where we are experiencing those types of narratives, and we're able to kind of situate it within our own shopping carts. And whether at that moment or at a later point, really begin to unpack sort of what is it going to mean for me now to have this in my cart, right? I think about sort of youth who, LGBTQ youth who, I love sort of this dialogue that I see at times among the LGBTQ youth who are talking about, the quiet silencing and the quiet manners in which, heteronormative sort of behaviors happen, that too often they're unsure of how to talk about it. And when they get the chance to talk about it, there's a level of excitement, right? Because they're finally able to tell their story. And we've got to own and recognize the power in being in that moment and actually feeling valued, for somebody to actually say, I just want to listen to your story, because it's something that I need to sort of sit in a space of imagining what's it like, what's that reasoning that I need to develop, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean that I need to be in a questioning stance, or I need to be in a, let me tell you about, how you should be thinking about it, but rather, let me just understand your own sort of set of experiences.
There are two more questions that I think would be great to hear your thoughts on. One is, Sylvia Brooks asks, some shopping carts are full of painful memories. So how do you respond in those situations?
So, part of one of the ideas that exists, that I talk about in terms of this equity literacy construct, is that there has to be some work around unpacking that, right? Like, we have to be intentional around knowing that of what is those painful elements that have to be necessarily unpacked, right? And how that kind of resonates. And the way in which I sort of sort of do that unpacking is through a series of sort of experiential types of activities that, as individuals, we need to be able to kind of have a moment to have them surface, but also have a set of protocols that allow for us to kind of unpack it in a safe manner, in a manner that allows us to, for those moments that are painful, that we're able to attach, to speak through the pain, and as well as compartment, or sort of make sense of sort of how that particular experience, that we're going to move it forward in such a way that we're going to find a way in which we replace it, right? So, for example, there's an activity that I do that's in my book that I call the friendship activity, where I have folks, I label different parts of a room of different racial, ethnic identities throughout the room. And I have people think about their best friends from elementary, secondary, college, and adulthood, right? And I have them think about what, not only all those best friends, but what did you do as a best friend? What's all the stuff that you did, right? And so what I end up having them do is, I have them first start with elementary school, thinking about that best friend or best friend. And I say, go to the corner that represents the racial or ethnic identification of that best friend. And so they go to their different corners, and I have them go to those corners and talk with each other about what's the fun stuff that you did? What's the stuff that you ended up sort of doing? And, folks have a good time really thinking about those activities going from elementary to secondary to college to adulthood, right? But what's interesting, and sort of to your point around sort of the pain that people bring, what I notice that there is, in particular for folks of color in that activity, that there is pain points. And the pain points that emerge is the degree to which some of them have shared as they have traversed, where they have lost friendships because either parents of their best friend said you can't be best friends with this person anymore, right? And what that necessarily meant for them, and now sort of sitting in a place where they're learning sort of some of the racial realities of that there's boundaries to who you're allowed to be friends with, right? And so part of what we have to sort of be attentive to in this work around sort of developing sort of this, not only sort of culture responsive and sustained pedagogy, is sort of making sure that, that if we're going to be culture responsive, we've got to contend with some of these pain points where we unpack them, right? Because what we don't want is for that stuff to surface itself as you are trying to diversify a text, or you're trying to, really ask different questions of your students, that you unpack that stuff and you find a way of really reimagining or replacing sort of what that learning has given you, and find a different place of replacement, right? And some of that involves being intentional about, building up sort of the experiences that let you do some different types of individuating, so you can construct a new memory around sort of what it means to have a best friend, right? Like I remember when I was in undergrad, it may not be surprising to some, but I was a little bit of a radical person, where there was one instance where there was the student senate decided to expend dollars to pay for a bench instead of paying for a Black History Month speaker that we had put in a proposal for. And we were livid, right? And so what did we do? The next Senate meeting, we went in and we had chains, and we locked the doors, chained up the doors, and threw the chains in the middle of the room and said, we're letting go of these chains because we're going to deal with why this decision was made. Afterwards, what I thought were good white friends, I lost so many of them, right? And it's years later when I asked friends who all of a sudden like lost memory around that reality, right? I didn't lose memory of it, right? Because that was a pain point for me. I asked like what was it that for you sort of you wanted to step away? And some of it, of one particular colleague said, is that I didn't see you as Black until that moment. And for me, of course, I said, well, what the heck did you see me as, right? But it helped to kind of help me to kind of make sense that there wasn't anything wrong with me, right? But I had to sort of really begin to sort of replace that particular experience and make sense of it moving forward.
Yeah, that's a really powerful story.
I hadn't thought about that in a while.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really powerful story about what is friendship, and the value and the importance of seeing your friends and really perspective taking, as you have on your slide there. But one more question that I wanted to ask you. We had Olivia is working on a proposal for a high school elective on race, and she's wondering about any resources that you might recommend. So I actually think this is important. I think a lot of us probably know good resources for teachers and adults. What about for kids?
Yes. So I think this is where I think the book that that Kendi did with Jason Reynolds, Stamped. There we go. I think it's such a great young adult version of Stamped from the beginning. Because part of what if you're going to do a class on race, right? it's really around sort of, I'm a sociologist of education by training. So for me, it is about sort of making sure that we're attentive to the social construct of it and sort of providing sort of youth an opportunity to understand the complexities of it, in a course I think is fabulous, right? And that's a sort of a recent text, but there's a lot of sort of novels that exist that I think can be used as a way to really talk about the complexity of race and how it gets lived. And in particularly, using novels that tell stories of racial interactions as a way for kiddos to kind of gain an understanding of that complexity of race is a strategy. But also, having an opportunity, I'm a big fan of that kids not only need to consume information, but they should go get information, right? So how can we also create in these types of courses where kids get to go and survey their peers and how they think about race, right? And because part of what we also want to inculcate our youth with is not only sort of all this great theory and knowledge and stuff, but let's have them actually practice, kind of reconstruct sort of the type of racial dynamic that they would like to see in their school. Give them a type of sort of signature assignment that is about reimagining their school, right? Like I remember high school. I remember Convening High School years ago. The kids of color decided to take on a project where they were going to ban the use of the N-word. They got T-shirts, they got buttons, right? They had all this teach-ins around it, and it was so amazing to see kids taking that on, where they said, no, we're going to do the work alongside our adults to kind of do this sort of this type of understanding around race and its complexity.
Thank you very much for that incredible talk and that conversation that we were able to facilitate. Technical difficulties notwithstanding, that was really a great opportunity to be a part of. So I wanted to thank everybody for participating. People were asking like crazy about video recordings. So let me say that each of the three hosts of this conference will be posting the videos from each session on their respective websites. So that's Rutgers Graduate School of Education, the NJACTE, and the New Jersey Department of Education. So you should be able to find them. Once they are posted, Chanel Harris, who is our amazing coordinator, will send out an email to all the participants that they're available. We also really need each of you to fill out our feedback form, which Stacy Leftwich just posted in the chat. If you need a professional development certificate for participating today, you need to fill out the feedback form. That's a question. If you answer that you need it, we will send you the feedback form. And
the certificate. We'll send the certificate.
Yes, we'll send the certificate. Thank you. Thank you, Stacy. It takes a village. Okay, and finally, please tweet about our conference. Let's get more people to be part of these conversations. At the bottom of the registration form that Chanel sent you, there are hashtags: Teach Like Me New Jersey, Advancing Excellence, Advancing Equity, and Equity in Action. And those are great hashtags to use to get the word out there. And Eddie, we can't thank you enough. This was tremendous. And our NJACTE president, John Henning, is going to give us just some final closing words. So Corey, if you will facilitate that.
Hello. Thank you so very much for attending this opening session of the 3rd Annual New Jersey Convening for Diversifying the Teacher Workforce. My name is John Henning, and I'm president of the New Jersey Association of Colleges for Teacher Education and dean of the School of Education at Monmouth University. It is my privilege and honor to make a few remarks to close the opening session of this illustrious event. First, I would like to thank Rutgers University, the New Jersey Department of Education, and the New Jersey Association of Colleges for Teacher Education for hosting, planning, and conducting the convening. I would also like to commend the conference committee under the leadership of Dr. Stacy Leftwich for their hard work to make this a virtual conference. While it is true that many conferences have now moved online, that does not mean the transition is easy or that success is guaranteed. Further, at the time the decision was made, it was not at all clear what a virtual conference should look like. So I would like to personally express my appreciation for their vision, their creativity, and their boldness in moving forward a highly original conference format. Please be aware that the conference will continue on a weekly basis for the next 3 weeks, October 14th, 21st, and 28th. All sessions are from 3 to 5 p.m. The second and third sessions will be interactive presentations, and the fourth and final session will be a panel presentation led by today's speaker, Dr. Fergus. I also want to express my deep appreciation and gratitude to Dr. Edward Fergus for his work. Dr. Fergus's body of scholarship is powerful, accessible, and rooted in the research. His voice is especially helpful in achieving a better awareness of our own biases, which can seem so subtle, yet have such a great impact on the lives of others. Thank you, Dr. Fergus, for sharing your voice today and for your dedication and your commitment to this work. We look forward to seeing you again on October 28th. In addition to listening to Dr. Fergus, we also need to read his work, as well as the work of like-minded colleagues, such as Kevin Kumashero, Margarita Bianco, Pam Gist, Robin DiAngelo, Tim Wise, and Patricia Hill Collins, among many others. Our awareness and knowledge of the social justice scholarship empowers us to be as strong advocates. Silence and apathy contribute to the practice of structural racism. The need for advocacy in New Jersey is great. Although diverse in population, New Jersey schools are highly segregated and most teachers are white females. Thus, New Jersey education is missing important voices who could challenge injustice. To become better, we need to find those voices, to listen to them, and likewise share our own. One purpose of the convening is to provide a platform for those missing voices through Dr. Fergus and the convening speakers. As I am sometimes reminded by my faculty, each of us has to do, quote, our own work. The work we do with ourselves is never ending, always evolving, as American culture continues to change and grow. I encourage you, during the remaining weeks of the convening, to do your own work. Listen closely, read widely, discuss deeply, and cultivate your awareness of social injustice. New Jersey needs you to be a strong advocate for more integrated schools and a more diverse teacher workforce. So in conclusion, thank you very much for coming today, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you, everyone. That concludes our first meeting of this annual convening, of the third annual convening. I'm going to keep the chat open in case anyone would like to make notes or copy anything from there. I know there's several links in there, so we're just going to wait and you can all leave at your leisure. And thank you again, Eddie. Tremendous job.